Hello.
Good morning, sir.
Hey, good morning. Or
How are
good
you?
afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, actually, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the class.
Hey, hello, class. Good morning. Are you awake yet? Almost.
Well, it's the end of the semester, so it's kind of rough.
Oh my God, it's tough. It's cold. It's dark. It's the end of the semester.
Well, it's not that bad over here, but...
Oh, all right. Okay. You guys are doing well. That's fine. Paradise.
So let me take a couple of minutes to introduce David. So Professor Zetland got his PhD from in agricultural and resource economics from UC Davis in 2008. He worked with Professor Michael Hanneman at UC Berkeley for a couple of years, working on a postdoc. And for the last few years, he's been based in the Netherlands. He's taught in Wageningen University.
Wageningen.
Say that again?
Wageningen. It's a terrible name. It's a very Dutch name, yeah.
So Wageningen University. He's also spent some time at Simon Fraser in Canada. And as of last August, he's based out of Leiden University in the Netherlands. David is a water expert, a water economist. The two of us met a few years ago in Amsterdam in a water conference. So when I found out that I had to teach a course in water policy, he was the first person I went to for advice. So it's a great pleasure to have him here today to speak to us. And I asked David to give us a brief introduction about himself, his background, his interest in water, and then we're going to open it up and have a discussion about all the various topics we've been discussing throughout the semester on water quantity and water quality. So, David, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, Nikos, thanks. Good morning, everyone, again. So, let's see. I'll just talk for a few minutes about me and where I come from, so to speak. I have a list of questions, Nikos, that you sent to me. Should I, for example, go through those questions and answer them, or how's the best way? Do you want to do that?
I'd say let's have a discussion and let's have the students ask you their questions.
Okay, good.
Have dialogue in this way. I think it might work better.
That's very easy. Okay, great. So I was born and raised in California, and I left California the first time when I was 21 to go to Europe, and I ended up as far east as Turkey. And I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, but after a few failures, let's call it, of trying to get rich, I went on a 5-year trip around the world. And in that trip, I went to over 60 countries, and I saw a lot of different cultures, a lot of different institutions, to use the word that's popular in Bloomington. And eventually I came back in the Bay Area, tried to get rich again with the dot-com boom. That failed. And then I went into graduate school. And my intention in graduate school was to do development economics because I wanted to see how countries develop or how they fail. And instead of doing that, I ended up doing water. And water ends up being a very interesting topic because, number one, water institutions vary enormously all over the world as well as within countries. And number two, there's a very strong role of governance or politics or whatever you want to call it, community in water management. And so I've spent a lot of time learning some of the generalities as well as some of the specifics of various ways of managing water. In the book that I've written 2 books. I think you guys have, which one is it? Abundance or End of Living with Water? Okay, great. So the first book I wrote was called The End of Abundance, and that was based on several years of blogging at Agronomics. And then, and that was, I call that the slightly more academic version because it has footnotes and references and so on. And then earlier this year, I published an updated version of that discussion, let's say, called Living with Water Scarcity, which is 40% of the length and a much more direct kind of book. And I mentioned that to you because I saw some of the questions that came in refer to stuff that I had discussed in End of Abundance. Some of those things, in fact, most of those things I'll still support in terms of the economics, and some of those I've moved away from because I think that I've found better ideas. One thing that brings up is that I'm always looking for better ways of doing things. I've tried to be neutral or not dogmatic as far as water policy is concerned. And you will find, if you discuss water, that it's a very polarizing issue for a lot of people. Unfortunately, sometimes to the point where they don't listen to what other people are saying. But I've done my best to listen to other people, and that's another reason why I think these discussions are helpful. So that'll be probably a good enough introduction, and then we can get to your questions.
So we've spent a good amount during the semester looking at different aspects of water policy, right? So we've had some readings from David's book, from other academic journals, from different books, different articles. So I want to open it up, and you guys have asked some very good questions. So instead of going through them one by one, I want to have a more lively dialogue with David. So who wants to start? Amanda.
Hi. So after your 5-year trip around the world, what societal and economic changes must be made to ensure the United States and other nations do not completely deplete their water resources?
It's a little bit fuzzy. What about the not depleting the water resources?
Because you talk about how.
Oh, sorry. I see your question. It's question 15. And I might ask for the number back because of the audio. So your question is, what changes must be made to ensure the United States and other nations do not completely deplete their water resources? I'll say that the first thing you want to keep in mind is that water is a renewable resource if the use is less than the return flows, let's say. So if you have precipitation, whether it's rain or snow, and that water is diverted for human use, and some of it still goes into the environment, then that can be, in fact, that is more sustainable than, number one, if you divert all of the precipitation towards, for example, irrigation, so you might actually dry out a river, or it's more sustainable than if you are taking groundwater and mining groundwater. So if you're interested in sustainability, you want to use less water than there is, number one, and number two, and how to do that is actually to manage water as a scarce resource. And that's not actually done in very many places. There's different versions of why that's not done. One of them might be that, for example, farmers are allowed to take as much water as they want from groundwater so that they might be draining aquifers. Another one is that the water rights for a river might be over-allocated so that the entire river can be dried out 3 or 4 times if all the water rights are exercised. So the sustainability is going to depend on recognizing that, and on the one hand, there's more demand than supply, and on the other hand, reducing that demand or reducing water rights or reducing the withdrawals is going to take away water from some people who think it's theirs. And that is a politically difficult discussion, but it's necessary if you're actually interested in that sustainability. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions? There are several similar questions that you have submitted along the lines of breaking the political boundaries, right, into water policy reform. So who wants to go next with a follow-up on a similar question? Mickey.
Just sort of like along those lines, have you ever kind of encountered a situation where some of the water rights were being taken away, and like, how was that done? Were there any lessons you learned from that experience? Something like that?
Yeah. There's lots of ways for that to happen. I'm going to try and think of the most unfair way. So the way that water rights are interesting in the sense that it depends on where you are. So you guys are east of the Mississippi, and in the United States, water rights tend to be riparian in those areas. Riparian rights tend to be specified as the right to use without impinging on others' use of the water, which east of the Mississippi is not so much about quantity but quality. So people might have their so-called right taken away, their right to pollute water, if it turns out that that's harming downstream neighbors. the definition of pollution has changed over the last couple hundred years. And so what's considered pollution today was considered normal in the past. Obviously, dropping raw sewage into a river is considered now a bad idea today, but 50 or 100 years ago, or even in some parts of the world, it's considered normal use. So redefining rights is one way that rights are taken away, in the sense that one person is being harmed by the other. And that ends up being a discussion of justice or a discussion of harm. And in some countries, it's acceptable to say that this harm is being done, and therefore we're going to take away your rights. In other countries, that's not acceptable because either because there's not a general recognition of water quality as an issue. But in the west side of the Mississippi, where water rights tend to be quantified as first in use, or first in time, first in use, or first in right, first in time, first in right, those rights are often specified as senior or junior rights, as in, if there's not enough water in the river, the people who were the newest arrivals to claim water supplies end up getting cut off. And that's supposed to be a normal procedure. On the other hand, a lot of governmental bodies are very hesitant to invoke that cut because of the political opposition from the more recent users. And that can be troublesome for the actual watershed because the water users end up depleting the watershed. In Australia, they had a system that was similar to the United States, the Western United States, in terms of quantified rights, and the government simplified those rights into not just 1868 rights are more senior than 1880 rights, but they quantified them into junior versus senior, which again meant that the junior rights would not always be delivered. And then what they did on top of that, so people saw a different. Now they have two types of rights instead of essentially an infinite number of types of rights based on the first diversion. But what they did on top of that is they started to declare that all rights, senior and junior, would be subsidiary to environmental water flows. And what that meant is that they were reserving water for the rivers before even senior rights would be allocated. And that was a reordering of priorities that certainly upset some farmers. That was taken as a decision because politically it was considered more valuable to maintain the ecosystem than to allow the economic use of water for agriculture. And the compromise that the farmers, the reason the farmers accepted that is because the senior rights became tradable and much more valuable by a factor of about 10. And what that meant is that farmers, even though they had fewer water rights to trade or to use, they could make a lot more money by selling that water. And the government was, on the one hand, taking away water in terms of the environmental flows or reservations, and then on the other hand, letting them make a lot of money from water trading. So that was a quid pro quo that a lot of farmers found acceptable. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question. Brandon, go ahead.
My question is number 10. I realized I wrote it backwards, but is there precedent for per unit water fees based off of, or directly proportional to per household member income?
Yeah. Yes and no. So in some countries, they don't use water meters as a way of charging people for water. And what that means is that you have a pipe coming to your house. There's no meter. You use as much as you want. And that system is in place in lots of parts of the United States as well as other countries. And what that means is that the people who use water do not pay according to how much they use. Instead, those systems tend to be supported through either property taxes or income taxes. And there's a high correlation between wealth or income and property taxes and obviously income taxes. So in those systems, richer people tend to subsidize poorer people in terms of how much money they put into the water system, given that richer people don't use as much water proportionally as poorer people. This is, of course, not true when rich people have huge lawns and fountains and pools. But if you're talking about indoor use, rich people don't tend to use as much water, or they use as much water, but or a multiple of the water of poor people, but not a huge multiple. And that ends up being progressive in a sense, if you're getting at that with your question. The move to pricing water based on use, therefore, is going to be regressive in terms of poor people who did not pay for their water. Now, take a stereotype. You have a two-person rich couple versus a six-person poorer family. Under the old system, the richer couple would pay a large share of the cost of the system. Under a new system of metered water pricing, the poorer people would pay a lot more because they're using more water. And that change from one type of charging to another is socioeconomically disruptive, and it led to a lot of protests recently in Ireland, for example. My suggestion in those cases is not that the government go back to charging for water based on your income, which is extremely complicated. If you think the IRS is complicated now, try and attach the IRS to your water bill, right? But is to make sure that poor people receive income support or a negative income tax. So for all kinds of reasons in life, and water would be one of them. Thanks.
There are several questions related to water pricing. Some of you have asked questions about the some for free mechanism. So who wants to go next? And let's keep the discussion a little bit on water pricing, since there seems to be a lot of interest there.
Those were my questions, but I'll ask for them. Are there concerns about secondary water markets, such as those who consume little water and selling the water to large volume consumers?
Right. Yeah, I saw that. That was an interesting question. In some ways, what I do when I discuss water pricing and water markets, in fact, is I split it in two pieces. And water pricing tends to apply, I think, to residential consumers who might be, using 100 gallons a day per person or something like that. Whereas water markets would tend to be more interesting for large water users, bulk water users, like farmers. The energy industry, fracking, is a very big user of water these days. And so in terms of water pricing, I tend to think of water at your tap. In terms of water markets, it tends to be bulk water, lower quality, no network involved. And if you have trading on the water market, it's not necessarily going to have a strong impact on the price of water at consumers' taps, which is mostly around the cost of running that network. But getting at what you're saying, if you have household consumers, and let's say there's a version of a some for free, pay for more, or a cap and trade, then the consumers, some of them might use less in their allocation, let's say. And in the book I discuss this actually under the human right to water as one potential way of allocating the right to water to individuals, and then allowing them to, for example, use some of that water and sell the rest, or sell it all and use that to pay for their drinking water. So if you were going to use some version of a cap and trade or some version of a property right in water for citizens, then the ones who are using less water would have the right to sell that excess and keep the money and use it for whatever they want. It could be education, something, lovely like education. It should be something like recreational drugs or cable channels, cable TV. But that's just, in a sense, the way they would spend their income, their right as a citizen. The funny version of your question would be that someone goes to their tap, fills up a couple gallons of water, goes across the street and sells it to someone else who's run out of their water supply. That would be heavy, high transaction costs, basically, of moving the water from one person to another. It's more likely that would happen through some kind of online trading platform. If you really did have this in a residential area, and someone, let's say they have the right to use, 100 gallons a day. They use 80 gallons a day. They sell the extra 20 gallons a day on the water exchange, and they don't touch the water. The water just gets virtually traded, and they receive some money in their account from someone who, someone who's using 120 gallons a day, let's say. But in most cases, water trading is much more likely to happen with bulk water. And it would start, for example, with farmers, which is where it started in most parts of the world.
So to stay a little bit on the issue of water pricing, there were some questions about the costs, the monitoring costs of the Some for Free mechanism that you propose in the book.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned how complicated it would be to base water pricing systems on income.
Yeah.
The Some for Free includes some level of complexity in the sense that you have to know the number of members in the household.
Right.
Which even that, something we might consider fundamental information, is not available to utilities. Right. And utilities are even trying to circumvent the requirement to get such knowledge. So how do you see implementation of this mechanism on the ground? What kind of enforcement and monitoring costs would there be?
Well, it's an excellent question, and that's why in my second book I dropped that idea, or I put it in a second priority. So there's the thing is that Some for Free, Pay for More is very appealing to a lot of people who want to have the water system deliver some form of social welfare. We want to have some for free so that we take care of people's human rights, and then we want to charge people for more so that people don't waste water. This is a form, by the way, of increasing block rates. And the first block is free. The second block is higher than free. So people ask questions about IBRs. So if people are really set and determined to have some form of increasing block rates or some form of social welfare via water pricing, I think Some for Free, Pay for More is a good way to go. Or even increasing block rates, although those are abused quite often. It does require, I believe, as you said, a head count in each household. In the United States, this is very problematic due to what I believe are extreme paranoia about household demographics. Certainly relative to what the NSA knows, getting a head count is not controversial. So if in other countries, like where I live now in the Netherlands or in Israel, there is an allocation based on the number of people in the household. So it is acceptable in other countries where they gather this kind of information. In the U.S., for example, you could implement this if consumers or water users agreed to supply a head count, whatever that would be. It could be audited. It could be social security numbers. And those who did not want to reveal their private data, for whatever reason, would not be given the Some for Free. They would just pay across the board for all units of water. That would be one way to compromise over this privacy issue. On the other hand, I pretty much discarded this idea for richer countries, developed countries, in favor of uniform pricing of water, which means that everybody pays the same for water, no matter how many people were there or how much they use. And if you think of it, obviously it's a simple parallel with gasoline prices. Nobody goes to the gas pump and says, there's 3 people in the car, you got to give me some cheap gas or some free gas, and then I'll pay more if I use more than my daily allocation. Although that happens in countries that are rationing gasoline, and that's a disaster. So what I would do with water in the United States, I would just say, look, let's have a high price. In where you guys are, that might be $2, $3, $4 per CCF per 748 gallons. And if you use more water, you pay more. If you use less water, you pay less. And that's how I would do it. It's much easier to administer. No one needs to care about how you use the water, how many people are there, if you have high efficiency toilets, or if it's summertime or whatever. It's just a straightforward way of managing the water like any other economic commodity.
Very good. Carter.
And would that price, that uniform price, be based off of the scarcity of all of the water in the United States, or is this a price that would be determined in each watershed?
Great question. I think first of all, it would be within the watershed. Secondly, the price would reflect, and so in the book I talk about, I believe, matching fixed costs to fixed charges to customers. And so that's basically the cost of managing that network, right? And then you have variable charges, which is based on the amount of water you consume, which should recover the cost of energy, for example, for pumping the water, cost of chemicals and energy for treating the water. And if water is abundant, which I believe it is in most parts of Indiana, then that variable charge would only be based on the cost of delivering water per unit of water to your household. If water is scarce, I would add a surcharge on top of that, which would be based on the local water scarcity, and the utility would know what that is. It's either based on groundwater, it's based on lake withdrawals, it's based on river systems. And different water utilities have different access rights to water. If those rights are constrained or limited, then compared to demand, that it would make a lot of sense to put a scarcity charge so that people have a reason to use less. It's important to remember that these three charges, the fixed charges, the variable charges, and the scarcity charges, are going to add up to more than the cost of delivery, because you have the fixed cost of delivery, the variable cost of delivery, but the scarcity is not part of a cost. It's a kind of a shadow price. It's an environmental cost, if you want. So the utility would have too much revenue. And that's, some people dislike that because it would be, they would call it profits, especially if it's a private utility or an investor-owned utility. And in those cases, I would I always recommend that the excess revenues be rebated per customer, as in per meter, which ends up being quite progressive because people who use less water would get a net rebate on their water bill. That was a bit complicated, but hopefully it answered your question.
Yeah, I'm curious, and I'm tying this into the end of question 8 here. In a state like Indiana where so much, I'm assuming you're referring only to household use.
Yes. Household use on a network.
So in a state where so much water is used for agriculture, and obviously that has a huge impact on scarcity, how do you determine household water prices given that there's other uses outside of households that are contributing so much to the scarcity?
Yeah, that's an important point. So let's take for granted that Indiana has a water scarcity problem due to overall use, right? So you've got at least two types of use. You've got agriculture, residential. You could have, commercial, industrial, thermoelectric, and so on. But just if we simplify it, we talk about municipal, industrial, M&I versus agricultural. The M&I use tends to be drawn by a big pipe that the water utility is going to use to take water out, clean it, and then send it through pipes to all the customers. And that's going to be residential, commercial, and so on, institutional, like your school. Then there's other users of the water from the same withdrawal location, and that's going to be farmers. So what you have is the utility is one heavy user, and the farmers are the other heavy users. And if there's scarcity, that means the demand is greater than supply on that river, on that aquifer, on that lake. And it's the job of the government to decide if overuse is happening, and it's the job of the government to limit withdrawals so as to protect either to protect the ecosystem, which is important, or to keep the water users from interfering with each other. In that sense, you would want to have some limited right of withdrawal, or the right of withdrawal would be limited to whatever the sustainable yield of the water source is, and the utility might get a priority. The utility might have a share, and the farmers also have a share. But what this means is the farmers will be limited on how much water they can take, as well as the utility, which may not be what they were used to. And that is the first step. That's a version of the cap. Once you have a cap, then you have to decide who gets allocation against that cap among the agricultural inside the agricultural community. That could be based on anything that makes sense, based on history. It could be based on historical use. It could be based on acreage. It could be based on who voted, who contributed to the campaign of the state senator. It really doesn't matter. So you have a cap, and then you have that cap is gives a certain number of rights to remove water from that body. The farmers would have some of those rights. The utility would have some of those rights. And then the farmers, in my opinion, should be able to trade those rights if they're next to other farmers for money, because what that does is it allows the farmers to use the water more effectively. In a cap and trade regime, the trade part will get you the efficiency, the cap part will get you the sustainability, but the allocation of permits out from the cap is a big deal in terms of equity, or it's a big deal in terms of wealth, and that ends up being very controversial because the more permits you get for free from the government, the more wealthy you will be if you can sell those permits. So that's me talking around your question, but I'm trying to answer it. But it's quite a big question you asked. Was that okay, or did I miss something?
No, not that.
Okay. Andy, you have a question?
Yeah, well, it was kind of a follow-up to that, some for free.
Sure.
And since you wrote your End of Abundance book, and even now today, have there been any other significant changes that you would add to over what was written about End of Abundance?
In terms of updating the stuff that I discussed in the book.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think I'm going to look at it. There's a new book, by the way. It's a free download, by the way, if you want some good Christmas reading. Haha. So
also put a plug in for your calendar that I saw this morning.
Yes. Plug the calendar. There's no. It's not a moment too late.
So David is coming up with a water calendar for 2015. So I'll send you guys the link. And having a Kickstarter campaign. So if anybody wants, they can contribute and get a nice water-related calendar for the next year.
So let me answer your question. There's a couple things that I did. The new book is shorter and it's tighter, but the structure is similar in terms of part 1 being about economic uses of water and part 2 being about social uses of water. But I was a lot harder in the second book on saying, look, we have to reserve social uses first. We have to reserve especially environmental water flows first, because those cannot be valued very easily or without controversy using economics. It's just difficult. And Nikos can tell you all about contingent valuation and all the rigmarole that goes on with that.
Probably so, since you started with Michael Hanneman.
Yeah, exactly. The Godfather. So number one, I put a lot more weight on reserving environmental water flows, and then allowing agriculture, cities, businesses, energy to all fight over the economic uses of water. Secondly, on the water wars chapter, which is short in both books, I kind of put a little bit more of an insight, I think, in the sense that politicians who are fighting with each other, let's say there's two jurisdictions and these guys are fighting with these guys over the water, those politicians might fight, to look good in the media, whereas the people who are actually potentially affected by this fight might not get anywhere with that fight. And in that sense, I think that, and if you take away, I put an example in the new book. If you look at politicians in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City, in the capital of Mexico, they're 5,000 kilometers apart, and they might be fighting with each other over the Rio Grande or the Colorado River. And that fight might be just for the media, whereas the people who are on the Rio Grande might have a lot more in common, a lot more at stake at resolving that dispute and working together. The same thing you could say in many, many countries. You've got the Tigris and the Euphrates between Turkey and Syria. You've got the Jordan River between Israel and Jordan and Palestine, which is extremely controversial. And so politicians at the national level tend not to be the best people to get into these conflicts over water across boundaries, political boundaries. That's another thing. And I think, there's a lot of stuff I can say, but usually I was getting more refined on the kind of discussion that you saw in End of Abundance. And the last thing I would say is that I put quite a bit more emphasis on water quality in this book, in the new book, because number one, it's becoming a very big issue, and number two, I think that, for example, I give you the most direct example. I think that when you guys probably paid attention to this algae bloom that happened in Ohio a month or two ago. which cut off Toledo's water supply. And that was, I heard a podcast where someone from the state government regulator was saying, well, we try and increase the water quality in the lake, but we're not really connected at all to farmers. And this is the state regulator who doesn't have much of a connection to farmers. So as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I understand, a lot of these water quality problems, whether it's groundwater or surface water, are definitely related to agricultural runoff. And agricultural runoff is considered a non-point source of pollution. And what that means is that it's often outside of the jurisdiction of various regulators because it's been written in as an exemption. But what I would do is I would declare, all the farmers in a section or all the farmers on a certain reach of a river to be responsible for the water quality in that reach of the river collectively. And then they would be collectively punished, fined, whatever you want to call it, if water quality in their reach, at the top of the reach, and the river flows down here. At the top, you take a measurement, say it's 10 parts per thousand or whatever, TDS. And if it goes up to 15 parts per thousand, that 5 parts per thousand is their responsibility. And the regulator would say, I don't care who did it. It's your responsibility. All of you are paying a fine, and you go figure it out. And this is, I think, a good way it's a collective action kind of solution to a collective action problem. And it allows farmers to, work among themselves because they know a lot more about what's going on than a regulator. And so I put, it's only a page or two of discussion in the book, but I think this is a good way to approach non-point source pollution that I didn't really work out so clearly, I think, in the first book.
And this is a theme that has been discussed in the literature a lot, right? So I think Kathleen Sigerson was the first one that came up with this approach of implementing a tax based on ambient concentration of pollutants, and then letting the individual polluters figuring out how they're going to come up with the funds to pay the tax. The question is, in that case, how easy is it to isolate the responsibility of farmers versus the responsibility of other polluters, like industrial polluters that could be also contributing to the same watershed?
Industrial polluters, industrial polluters are much more simple usually. They have a plant, a factory, whatever you want to call it, and they have a big intake and a big discharge. And so they're much more like a point source. Farmers tend to be non-point in lots of ways, and you can look at the topography to find out who's within the watershed, and just assign gross responsibility to all of them. This is, as far as some farmers are concerned, ridiculously unfair. On the other hand, there's a need, I believe, to work on these issues from the community perspective. In a lot of communities, and this is, Ostrom would say this in bold print. A lot of communities, before there was ever, outside government, they resolve their water issues among themselves. And I would say this is a good idea to lean upon in terms of contemporary water issues as well. And so, someone might complain that's not fair. I'm sorry, you live in that community. What the community is doing to the downstream community is not fair, and that supersedes your desire to exempt yourself from responsibility.
Mickey?
So the system you were describing a moment ago, like with monitoring river reaches and individual farmers. I know a lot of states kind of push agricultural BMPs as a way to kind of diminish and mitigate nutrient pollution runoff. How far do you think that goes in accomplishing that same goal of kind of assigning responsibility and I don't know what I'm trying to ask. Compared to this watchdog scenario you just described, how good is a BMP scenario?
So, you're looking at two different watchdogs, right? So one watchdog is the guy who shows up and says, do you have a setback? Are you, I'm going to measure your nitrogen load on a particular sample and so on. So the regulator must police the BMPs. The problem is that BMPs, of course, they might be written weakly. This is a regulatory capture problem. Or that say they're written strongly, but they're inappropriate for that particular area. So farmers are forced by regulation to do things that make no sense in terms of addressing the problem. what I'm getting at is not the replacement of BMPs, but the use of an outcomes approach to say, I don't care what you do. If the water comes out dirty, you're going to get penalized. And if you do all the BMPs and it's still coming out dirty, then you're still in trouble. If you do nothing or you move one cow over, I don't know, and you fix the problem, then you're off the hook, right? So it's much, as far as I'm concerned, it's much better to focus on results or outcomes than to focus on regulatory check boxes, which industry tends to like because you check the boxes and then you move on, but it doesn't get you where you need to go sometimes. And that, if you want to take another, another way of thinking about that is sometimes water quality in the poorest countries, they test water quality by just dropping drinking water into a fish tank. And if the fish is dead, the drinking water is not good. And if the fish is alive, the drinking water is okay. And that's how they do, essentially a holistic test of water quality. And they don't have a lot of technology or money, but they're using this biological indicator to try and proxy for safety for the people who are drinking the water. And, as far as I'm concerned, I'd be much more interested in drinking water that a fish can live in than drinking water where someone checked all the boxes on BMPs.
Christine?
I kind of don't agree with that, just because we don't really necessarily understand the complete link between like what the farmer's activity is and what the pollutant outcome would be. Right. So, if a farmer is doing all the best management practices that they can and doing everything that, to our knowledge, is working, but they're still not getting the output numbers that are necessary, it might be like some residual effect or something else. But I think it's kind of unfair to put so much on the farmer when if they're trying their best. So I don't know about doing that.
Yeah, well, that basically means the farmer has the right to pollute. And I don't hold to that right. So if you have plumes of, like in Southern California, they have groundwater which is extremely polluted by defense industry that was happening there for 70 years. And those aquifers are destroyed from a quality perspective. And the companies are, Lockheed Martin and McConnell Douglas and all that are still in business. They're not paying for their pollution. If farmers' best management practices result in pollution, and that pollution is considered to be excessive by regulations, then those farmers should not be farming.
Right, but then it's also like, what if they're doing the best management practices and they're following that? What other measures would they be doing to reduce their pollution?
They would not farm.
Okay.
So
what this is a taking, right? What you say is that your practices are violating the commons. And that's possible in lots of different circumstances, and we've seen that happen in lots of circumstances. It's called, smoking in restaurants is not allowed today. And farmers who say, we're doing the best we can, but sorry, you're still getting polluted, I agree that that's a difficult position for the farmer to be in. It could be extremely costly. But a lot of farming practices are not acceptable today that were acceptable in the past. And the action is not to say to grandfather those people in. The action is to say you can't do this anymore. And there's numerous examples of. And I by the way, I wouldn't put farmers on the top of the list of polluters. Right, the biggest polluters are mines and oil and gas industries in terms of the damage they do for the economic value they create. But farmers are part of the problem. And if the public will and the political will and the regulations are all about protecting water quality and farmers are part of that problem, then they have to be policed against that. And if their property, like you said, it's a good point. If their property has residual runoff from nitrates that have been applied over the last 40 years, then that's going to be if they stop farming, then they can't. Let's say it this way: if they stop farming, I wouldn't find them culpable. But on the other hand, that might still be a problem. And we see this with toxic cleanups like PCBs I think it's the Hudson River in New York, or maybe I'm wrong. But General Electric has paid hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up industrial waste left behind from what they were doing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that's again, that's paying for your damage you do. And it's sad, but it's also not fair to let people pollute and then walk away from it.
If I may just add to this discussion, I think the additional level of complexity here, and David mentioned the algal blooms earlier, is the scientific uncertainty with regards to the lag time, the amount of time it takes for nitrogen and phosphorus to enter waterways from the moment that they will be applied.
Right.
And I think that's something we've seen with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL program, right? That even though farmers are achieving the thresholds in terms of amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus that are applied, we still have not seen the results in the Chesapeake Bay in terms of improvement of environmental quality, exactly because it takes decades for pollutants to be removed from the waterway completely. And I'm guessing that's what is behind Christine's comments.
It's a terrible problem. Yeah, I agree. And if you look at CO2 lag, we're screwed as far as the Earth is concerned. These lags are, so it's not exactly a good response to say, well, there's going to be a lag, so we should keep doing what we're doing, because that doesn't get at the first issue.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. And on the other hand, I think it's absolutely important and significant to try and trace the interrelationships and the interactions, because you have hundreds of chemicals and various substances in water, and they interact in very different ways. So I'm all for scientific study, but on the other hand, you have to assign responsibility first. You have to assign property rights first. And maybe in Indiana, the property right would go to the farmer. And the cities, like Bloomington, would have to pay the farmers to stop doing what they're doing. That's one way of being fair as far as farmers are concerned, but addressing the problem as far as the city paying farmers to stop either using their land or using the same chemicals and fertilizers and so on their land. Let me add one thing. The title of my book, The End of Abundance, is really it's based on the theme called Abundance is Over. We have to change what we're doing. We can't do what we used to do anymore. And that is, you can't underestimate the amount of disruption this will cause. Imagine Americans being told that they can't drive. That would be like a World War III or worse. I don't know. It's like a zombie holocaust, because the vast majority of Americans are very dependent on their cars. And telling them they can't drive would be a huge shock to the system. But what I mean by end of abundance is that we are facing just such a shock in some places, whether it's water quality or water quantity. And the thing to do is to start to think different about how we do these things, how we manage water. And that's where a lot of places are not making changes. And I think that's going to be problematic.
Should we move? Raya, go ahead.
So, with the end of abundance, we need to change.
I lost sound.
Oh. Can you speak up?
Can you hear me now?
David? What happened? Let me check 1 second. Audio. You can't hear me? No. Let me start.
We can cancel on the discussion.
What's that?
Hang on.
All right, try again. I hear you. Yep.
Perfect.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So Raya was going to ask a question.
All right, in those 2 minutes, I almost forgot my question. So we talked about the issues and barriers of implementing something like some for free, that there's a question of privacy and getting all the data and monitoring. And you're talking about there needs to be these changes in management, and something like a uniform pricing system is a much more easy to implement. So what is the barrier with all this academic research that is acknowledging the scarcity of water with pretty easy implementation solution? What's the barrier between these utilities implementing those solutions? I guess what's the barrier?
Yeah, well, increasing block rates. So the some for free is similar to increasing block rates. So let's talk about that. In the Midwest, where you guys are, especially around the Great Lakes, decreasing block rates were used for years, and they still are used in a lot of places. And that was based on the economic theory that you should pay less the more you use because of the cost structure of the utility. Most customers have no idea the cost structure of the utility, and they don't care. Likewise, increasing block rates are based on the idea that you should have some water for cheap and more water for more to reflect the scarcity of water to the utility, which again, most utilities don't care, or sorry, customers don't care. And when you go to the gasoline pump, you don't pay cheap, a couple gallons cheap because that oil came from Saudi Arabia. Some more gallons are more expensive because that came from whatever, Venezuela. And the most expensive gasoline in your car is coming from North Dakota or from the oil fields in Canada. So pricing water to consumers based on the cost structure is not necessarily easy for consumers to understand. And it's based on a little bit of a fetish, I believe, to adopt economic theory into water pricing. And the reason that happens, and this is a very interesting point, is that water utilities are monopolists. They're not necessarily in markets in any sense. And if you go look at a market, you can't really find any example of some for free, pay for more. You might think, oh, that's my mobile phone plan, but that's not the same at all. And so monopolies are adopting these tariffs, whether it's decreasing block rates, which is found in markets, in competitive markets. They might have uniform rates, which are found almost everywhere you look on volumetric pricing, or they might have increasing block rates, which are not used pretty much anywhere. And they do that because academics have recommended it. The consultants will sell them the services. And by the way, rate setting for increasing block rates costs a water utility, on the order of $50,000 to $100,000 of consultant fees. So it's actually quite expensive. Then they have to spend a whole bunch of money explaining the bill to the customers. So I think it's a bit of ironically, it's an academic idea that's gotten into the wild, and I think it's not necessarily helping anything. And so a barrier of moving from increasing block rates to uniform rates is that people are in love with the idea of increasing block rates as something that will be pro-poor, even though they're not doing a headcount adjustment. So in fact, they're doing it incorrectly. And number two, they think it's going to charge water wasters more, when in fact, again, ignoring the headcount, they may not be accurate about who's who's wasting water, let's say. So I think that the thing to do is to say, look, uniform rates plus a scarcity surcharge, which is the same as saying gasoline at $3 a gallon plus a $1 a gallon surcharge when Nigeria goes into civil war again, is the way to ration the resource to consumers and recover your costs, of course. So I think the water industry suffers from these how do you call it? Kind of a traditional hangover that's based on how we used to do things. And it's a similar tax on efficiency, or it undermines efficiency the same way as other habits undermine efficiency for various nations. And, I'll give you an example. In the United States, I'm kind of somewhere in between in the Atlantic here, but, Americans still use pounds and feet compared to kilos and meters, when kilos and meters are extremely easy to use relative to pounds and feet. But pounds and feet are to tradition. And when you're in the tradition, you don't necessarily think about the cost of going back and forth all the time with pounds and feet. But it's much higher when you compare the cost of doing things or just talking about things in terms of meters and liters and kilos. So it's the change seems to be costly to the people who are in the system, but the newer method of doing things actually ends up being better in almost every way possible. So the question is, are you willing to change to get better results? And to give you an example, it's like sometimes you're dating somebody, and after a couple of years, you're thinking, maybe I don't want to be with this person anymore. And, someone might say, no, you shouldn't break up. You've been dating them for years. You should stay with them. It's a tradition. It's the way we've been doing things. And you might say, no, actually, I think I'd rather break up with this person and go find somebody else because it's worthwhile to me in the long run. And that's the same logic I would use for changing water pricing.
Melissa?
So do you think one way to overcome this like change barrier is if we taught people in like middle school or high school about our utilities? Like these are things that affect our everyday life, but I was never explained anything about a water bill or how my water use would be perceived to anyone else. And have you seen any other countries that teach the youth about these types of things? And just one more follow-up question is, do you think like a group of caring citizens could make a change in their own water utility? Like if we petitioned and saying, we want uniform block rates for these reasons and we took this to the utility board, like could that be a thing?
Yeah, you have great suggestions. By the way, that's one of the activities in the calendar to go meet your local water managers and ask them about these questions. So what I would suggest, in fact, is and other countries have absolutely done these things. Israel has a real problem with water with Palestine, but if you ignore that for a moment, they've been extremely aggressive about changing the way they do things and reforming their water tariffs and their water charges based on their national security interest in ensuring that people have water and that they're not suffering. And Australia, of course, went through a 10-year drought where they did major reforms, not just in terms of engineering by building huge desalination plants, not just in creating water markets or markets for salinity, but also for raising the price of water. Consciousness spread like crazy through Australia. I mentioned that in the book where the people of Brisbane reduced their water use dramatically without even increasing the price of water because it's a question of consciousness. So yes, people can change, and people have changed, for example, in various parts of the United States because water, remember, is very local and very communal. What I would recommend if you're interested in this topic nearby is go talk to the water utility, see the kinds of issues they're facing, see maybe if some things can improve as far as their interactions with their customers, as far as the water being taken from the environment or the water quality, discharges, and so on. And the easy way to do this, I think, is to do a pilot system where, a square mile of houses, for example, would be put into a new billing system or with smart meters or with anything else, and then they could see are customers happier? Is water use falling or rising? Is it easier for the utility to manage? And pilot programs are always a good idea because you never want to shift over a whole city without seeing how this is working. And I think that in some places. I know that I was a consultant for a company that did smart meters, and they ran, it was called AquaQ, and they got bought by a Midwestern company, Badger Meter. They're in Milwaukee. But they ran water conservation competitions in the dorms at UC San Diego. And the students there didn't have any idea how much water they were using because it was a dorm. It was a huge one big meter. But because of the competition, they thought differently about water, and usually that's very helpful to understanding what's going on. And they had the winning dorm got free pizza, I think. And thinking about water sometimes is all you need to do. But I'm a big fan of reinforcing thinking for the people who are very aware. I call this the 20/80 rule. I'm a big fan of saying, look, the 20% are going to do the right thing because they get up in the morning, they can't wait to do the right thing. The 80% can't be bothered because they're late to class, and honestly, I just brushed my teeth with a tap running my whole life, etc. The 80% tend to be compelled to think more about water when the price is more salient to them. And then the combination of thinking about it and changing your habits and the prices, especially if you get a rebate check from the utility because you use less water, I think all those things can be very productive in terms of rationing the resource or managing the resource, as well as keeping the system fiscally solvent, which every water manager is very interested in. How are we going to pay our bills, right? Not their salaries, but they have debt that goes out 50 years in the future. So if you say, look, we're going to save water, but you're not going to go bankrupt, you've got their attention right then and there. And I think that kind of discussion and pilot programs is probably the good way to go.
Other questions? Okay. Eliska.
I had a question about fracking. So, water quantity is a big issue in a lot of states in regards to fracking, and a lot of lobbyists that are for the oil and gas industry like to praise how little water that they use compared to agriculture or other uses.
Right.
But a lot of that water isn't returned to the water cycle, so it's actually consumed and removed. So how should that water use be treated differently?
Good question. So the easy answer is that if you want to go, to the most simple solution, it's expensive, but it's simple, and that is that the fracking companies can source their water and they have to clean it up 100% before they discharge it. And sometimes, so what's common is frackers will take water out of, let's say, a lake or out of shallow groundwater. They'll frack. Some of the water will stay down there. It depends on the well. You might get return flows. In a lot of states in the U.S., the return flows are allowed to be injected and exempt from water quality regulations. And that could be troublesome. And like you said, that water may never come back into the hydrological cycle. Sometimes they can dump it in open pits and they try and retain it, and they might clean it and they might not. So the current practices, I think, are very worrisome from a quality perspective. From a quantity perspective, they definitely can deplete an aquifer the same way that a bottled water company might deplete an aquifer, because farmers that are taking water out, a lot of their seepage might go back in the aquifer, especially if it's shallow. So farmers tend to have less of an impact than frackers or other major extractors. But what I would do is I would say, number one, you can extract if the aquifer or the surface water is not under stress, which is a big qualification. And number two, whatever you get out of that the ground, and we might even make you suck it out of the ground, I don't know, you've got to clean up to if not drinking water level, but a good enough level to discharge, cleaner than the river goes into, let's say. And here's the thing: if you actually make that requirement of the frackers, now they've got all this clean water they just paid a lot of money for to clean, and they'll use that again to frack, or they'll clean it halfway and use it to frack. So they'll end up recycling a lot of water if you require that they clean it up. And that ends up reducing the problem of taking extra water out of other sources as well. They're going to bitch and moan about how it costs them money, and I'll tell you, if they're making money, they should spend money. And they do that on salaries, they do that on trucks, and they do that for lease rights, etc. So they might as well do that for water.
I'm just curious if like in the electric grid situation in the United States, where a lot of states are deregulating who puts the power on the grid, but the grid itself is publicly owned.
Yeah.
In terms of drinking water supply, I know in a lot of places the network of drinking water supply, especially in southern Indiana, is pretty well meshed out. I mean, a lot of crossover and connections between separate utilities. It seems to me like there could be a case made there for an introduction of competition between providers of clean water onto the network that may be publicly owned.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned that in the book you guys have. It was tried in the UK under what was called common carriage rules. And what that meant is that the grid was open to any of the eligible utilities to supply water. The utilities could, and this is done with natural gas quite often, which is a much more higher value product and actually a lot easier to mix in some ways. But if you had a grid, and let's say you have 3 or 4 utilities, or even, I don't even know, a dozen utilities that can supply water in that grid, assuming they have water of a sufficient quality, they could potentially sell it to any customer that's also on the grid. And what would happen is that they would get paid, but they have to be able to pay a carriage fee to whatever utility is maintaining the pipe on that reach. This ends up being difficult. It's not so hard to do, I think, on paper, but there's a lot of reforms that have to happen institutionally. One way to go about that is to actually make the entire grid one monopolistic unit, let's say, like a railroad grid. And then the utilities actually don't even own the grid. They just supply at the points, at the end points. And then their customers are at the take points. And that would require some accounting, not, I think, insurmountable, especially if you use master meters on distribution points, which are, fairly accurate for large volumes. So it's possible. Is it a good idea economically? It means that you're going to have utilities. In some ways, what you want is that some utilities are going to go out of business because they're not good at supplying water. Either their source is too dirty or their operations are too expensive. If you're going to have every utility competing there, then it may not make sense because you're not necessarily pushing towards some kind of efficiency. So it's interesting to think where that would go. And when they tried in the UK, it turned out to be very difficult, mostly because customers didn't necessarily trust buying water from some utility that was not their local utility. And the local utilities didn't like it at all.
Other questions? Brandon.
I was interested in your discussion of negative income taxes, which I don't really see as feasible in the United States. It hasn't been discussed since the 70s, and I think that when you're looking at a physical resource like water, you can more easily make equity gains. If you go to a poor farmer and say, we need your boats, we're going to help provide cheap water. I think it's much more easy than to say, we're going to institute this countrywide negative income tax, which is hard to understand. It requires trust in the federal government, which all poor people.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no end of politicians promising free stuff, is there? And the problem is that they do that, and then they deliver free stuff, and then someone else has to pay. So, if you guys want to keep an eyeball on something, watch on two things. One is the environment getting depleted, and the other one is that essentially aquifers getting depleted. And those two sources of water are the ones that are bearing the brunt of overallocation of water in various parts of the United States as well as the world. Do I have an argument against politicians giving away free stuff? Not exactly, except that it's not as free as they think. There's no free lunch. It's the cliche from academics, right? From economics. The negative income tax in some ways already exists. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And it's very poorly managed in the United States, mostly because people who file for it have to meet a bunch of requirements, and they're very heavily audited. Ironically, much more audited than millionaires are audited. So because of this paranoia about welfare queens. So I don't think that you have to run negative income tax credit within a water utility. What you could do if you just take the idea of pricing water with a scarcity price, then you could rebate money to the customers in their water bill. You don't have to deal with IRS at all. So a water utility could run a refund system where they charge more for the use of water because of scarcity, and they rebate the excess revenue to their customers as a way of getting rid of the so-called profits. They could do that right now without any interference from either state or federal governments. But I think that I wouldn't price water cheaply to help poor people, whether it's poor farmers or poor residential people.
And that's the misconception often, right? That poor people cannot pay for water. And we have cases in developing countries where they actually pay more than customers.
Oh, far more. Yeah, a factor of 10. Yeah, in poor countries, they will pay 10 or 20 times the price that rich people will pay because they're off the network.
Exactly.
And rich people are on the network.
Yeah.
And they pay a lot of time, etc. It's a lot. It's a huge cost.
Yeah, time component. Next question.
And maybe our last one, Nikos?
Sure. Of course. Maybe.
But that's okay. I've already asked a couple questions. I don't know if I mentioned them.
Anybody that hasn't asked a question?
All right, well. I was just curious. I used to live in Oosterbeek, like right next to you. And I was curious, like, how living in the Netherlands had kind of influenced your work and how you liked it. And I don't know, I was just curious about that because, yeah.
It's a good question to end on, let's say. My parents, my father was a migrant to the United States, from England. My mother, was actually born she actually grew up in Huntington, Indiana. And, moved around the time I was born, moved to San Francisco, and I live in Amsterdam now, which I consider to be the kind of city that San Francisco would like to be, in terms of two main things. One is the quality of life here is much higher in San Francisco, and the other one is that the social context here is civilized. I don't know how to say it. You know, the Dutch are willing to sacrifice income to make sure that poorer people are taken care of. The health system works here, the education system works here, the water system works here. I ride my bike everywhere. The public transportation system works here. So there's the drug policy works here. There's a lot of things that work in the Netherlands, so I kind of consider myself a migrant here. I've been working on water issues in the United States for 10 years, or in the world, but mostly in the United States. And, you know, the only thing that I see as a good thing is that, you know, there's 50,000 water utilities and many, many irrigation districts in the country. So there's a lot of room for experimentation without worrying about what your neighbors are doing. The thing that I see is a sad thing is I think that in the United States there is a bit of a myopia about the future. And the Dutch have, as you probably know, but others may not, they have a 100-year time horizon when they plan for their urban activities, and sometimes people they plan their lives that far in advance. And they do that because they have to keep their country from flooding constantly. And that kind of long time horizon and the necessary cooperation that entails means that they can't just go off and get their own piece of land and I don't care about my neighbors. They really do have to cooperate. And they might be blunt and they might not talk to you, but in the end, they really make those policies based on mutual survival. And that is, they've turned it into a benefit so that, you know, people are willing to put in the work to take care of each other, and they benefit from that in terms of safety and, you know, I could ride my bike around here in any neighborhood day or night and not feel unsafe, for example. I do lock it because there's a lot of bike thieves, but, you know, there's other things. Most of the things that I worry about in the U.S., I do not worry about in the Netherlands.
I think the saying is,
come visit.
Bikes are public property, locks are a challenge, right? For the Netherlands. David, thank you very much. We really appreciate the interaction. And I might say there were a couple of questions, a couple of things we didn't have time to pick up, so maybe I will. Lost the sound again.
Are you going? Okay. You all right?
Yeah.